In this video, I'll give you not one, not two, not three, not even four, but 5 ways to figure out your perfect shift points. Plus, I'll let you all in on a little secret as to why the LTD went from a 12-second car to a 9-second car at the track on only 6 psi of boost from the Sledgehammer electric supercharger, and it's related to all this shift point stuff. Finally, of course, I'll wrap it all up with a moment of Roger. I've been racing for over 30 years. In that time, I've picked up a few tricks that I'd like to share with you all while Alex Labs is still being built. Before we dive right into the 5 ways to find your perfect shift point, I need to clarify a few things that will hold true for all of them. If you have more than a 2-speed transmission, you may need multiple shift points. The reason will become clear as we go through these methods. The LTD has a built power glide transmission, only 2 speeds, low and high, or as I like to call them, fast and faster. Once you start getting to elevated power levels, you'll find a low, in other words numerically high, first gear ratio generates nothing more than tire smoke, ripping through the gear in a second or less, making a low first gear basically useless. And you need less rear gear for the same reason, particularly if you have a broad power band, which the electric supercharger gives the LTD in spades. Take a look at this graph. Once the electric supercharger is spooled up, it gave the LTD something closer to a horsepower line rather than a horsepower curve. There are reasons for that which we won't go into in this video. Let's stay on track. Ha! Oh, one more thing. Unless you have a super peaky engine like a 10,000 RPM naturally aspirated motorcycle engine, in most cases, getting close is close enough. Missing the optimum shift point by a little bit isn't going to significantly slow you down. Weather, track prep, and other variables play a much bigger role. So let's take a look at the first method. Method number 1, the dynograph method. Now this, of course, assumes you have a dynograph. This is the most accurate method, but you've got 4 other options if you've never run your car on the dyno. However, it's pretty important that you understand this method to help you understand the others. Hopefully you've seen my last video about horsepower versus torque. If you have, or if you're just smart, you'll understand why a torque graph is meaningless for shift points. After all, horsepower is work, torque isn't, and horsepower already takes torque into account. In other words, if you want to go as fast as possible, for shifting purposes, you only care about horsepower. Specifically, you want to maximize horsepower being put to the wheels. That sentence is important because it literally says it all. I'll repeat it. You want to maximize power to the wheels. Besides the dynograph, you'll also need to know your gear ratio so you can figure out the engine's RPM drop between shifts. Generally, this seems pretty straightforward in a stick shift car or a car with a locked torque converter. You can use an online calculator to figure this out. Spicer Parts has a good one on their website. Now, I have no affiliation with Spicer other than having bought their U-joints and drive shaft yokes and stuff over the years, and you can use anyone's calculator or figure it out yourself with a real calculator, but let's use Spicer's. Before we can use their calculator, we need to look at a dynograph. This is one of the LTD's naturally aspirated dyno poles. Again, we want to maximize horsepower under the curve. The peak is around 5,450 RPM. Let's just call it 5,500 RPM. Let's say you have a first gear ratio of 2 to 1, a second gear ratio of 1.5 to 1, a rear gear ratio of 3.08 to 1, and a 26-inch tall tire. Using Spicer's calculator, I'll put a link to it in the description below, we first want to figure out how fast we're going at 6,000 RPM in first gear. And that gives us about 75 miles an hour. So when we shift into second gear, which again has a ratio of 1.5 to 1, the engine RPM will drop to 4,500 RPM to match that mile an hour. Now that's a pretty big drop, but let's take a look at our dynograph. At 6,000 RPM, we're still making pretty good power, but dropping all the way back to 4,500 RPM really hurts us. Look at how much less power we're making down there. So obviously, we need to raise the shift point. Let's say this engine has a 6,250 RPM redline. Well, mostly because it's as far as we pulled it on the dyno. So let's plug 6,250 RPM into Spicer's calculator, and that gives us a bit over 78 miles an hour. And then when we shift into second gear with a ratio of 1.5 to 1, our RPM drops down to about 4,700 RPM, giving us about the same 78 miles an hour. Now looking back at the graph, you can easily see that going from 6,250 RPM to 4,700 RPM gives us more average power to the tires than 6,000 RPM dropping down to 4,500 RPM. In some cases, you'll find that you can't wind the engine up high enough to hit that optimum shift point. So then just run it up to the red line and get as close as you can, which would be the case here. But you can also see that it's pretty easy to eyeball maximum power. You don't need to do all this heavy math to figure this out. Now, I did mention how this RPM drop is extreme in this case. That's because the LTD runs an unlocked torque converter. Generally speaking, for a given power level, an unlocked torque converter will always fall back to the same RPM point. And that RPM point is dictated by the engine's torque, the load on the converter, which is a product of how heavy the car is, and the car's gearing. Less gear, that is numerically lower, loads the converter more, leading to more slip, which is actually not slip, but there's also some torque multiplication going on there, which is the secret voodoo of torque converters, leading to generally a quicker car than a stick shift car transmission can usually muster, particularly with today's horsepower levels. Now, I'll illustrate this when I get to why the LTD picked up so much with the electric supercharger, but for now, let's move on to method number 2. So method 2 works best if your car isn't too heavily modified. In other words, you haven't done anything that would dramatically shift your car's power band. Aftermarket air filters, mufflers, and stuff like that fall into this category. Changing camshafts and intake manifolds will move your horsepower peak around significantly, so if you've done that, this method probably won't work all that well for you. Assuming you have no mods that move your power band around, you'll generally be able to find at least a peak horsepower rating at a particular RPM. If you're lucky, you'll be able to find a dyno graph from the car's manufacturer. Alternatively, you may be able to find a dyno graph from a very similar setup. For example, there's pretty much nothing unique or rare about 99% of the LS cars out there, and you might be able to find a dyno pull video or a graph from a very similar setup. But be aware that not everyone is honest about their setups or dyno numbers, and torque converters can do weird things to dyno charts, so keep that in mind. That said, once you have an idea of your peak horsepower RPM, you can use the techniques from method number 1 to figure out your optimum shift points. If all you can find is just a peak horsepower RPM number but no dyno graph, then at least you know you'll need to shift above that RPM for your faster times. To estimate a little closer, try putting the RPM that peak horsepower occurs at right in the middle of the RPM drop between shifts. So if you're making peak power at 5,500 RPM and you have a 1,000 RPM fallback on the shift, you'll want to shift around 6,000 RPM and let it fall back to 5,000 RPM. That's a pretty safe bet that at least you're close because you're straddling that horsepower peak. And if you can't get to that upper number because of your car's redline, then again, just shift that redline. This may require a little bit of experimenting, particularly if your car's horsepower drops off severely after the peak. You may need to move that shift point down. But this will get you in the ballpark most of the time. Now let's look at method number 3. So method 3 is testing with a Dragy. A Dragy is used by a lot of grudge racers and car people in general to get some good performance numbers when it's not race day. A Dragy is a GPS-based performance meter that interfaces with your phone. I've used my Dragy at the track and can vouch for their accuracy personally. Dragys are extremely accurate. They're also pretty affordable and easy to use. I'll put a link in the description below. You can use the tips from method number 2 above to get a starting point, and then it's a simple matter of empirical testing, which is always the most fun kind of testing, particularly when it comes to car stuff. Some new cars have built-in performance monitoring features similar to a Dragy as well. Now, I do feel obligated to say that you need to do this in a safe place, please. A Tesla Plaid doing a quarter-mile Dragy blast in a school zone is not a safe place. I realize that for anyone who's not a half-wit, and the vast majority of you who watch my videos are definitely not half-wits based on your comments, most of you are full-wits, with only a few quarter-wits sprinkled in here and there, but this should seem obvious. But I have seen a Dragy video of a moron doing exactly that. I hope the cops saw the video and the fool is now where he belongs, bent over in front of Bubba at the local big house doing some empirical testing of his own involving stretching. Hopefully before he took out little Sammy and Stacy playing hopscotch on the sidewalk. 1,000 horsepower car is not a joke. It really isn't. In other words, respect the power. On to method number 4. Method 4 is testing on a drag strip. Even if you're not a drag racer, there's no reason why you can't use a drag strip to figure out your optimal shift points. Most drag strips have a test and tune night, usually Friday nights at the strips I've been known to haunt, and that's a great way to get some distraction-free, safe testing in. If your car has a data logging feature, then you can certainly use that, but you can also use a camera pointed at your tach to help you analyze your shift points and how they correlate with your time slips after the fact. I used to do just that with a video camera shooting my gauges back in the day before I had data logging, and it worked great. And there's a good chance you might get hooked on drag racing. It's about as addictive as meth, but legal, more fun, and a lot safer. And you get to keep your teeth. You've been warned. Let's look at method number 5. So method 5 is a lot like using the Force. And like using the Force, you need to be at least a low-level Jedi. And by Jedi, in this case, I mean experienced in car racing. After you've been doing this for a while, you can just get into a car and get close almost immediately just by feeling things out. Jason Smith, who's been driving my car for most of our electric supercharger testing, did just that the first time he was in it. In fact, after we changed the torque converter and added the meth injection, he made a similar comment to me after his first hit because the power band was so radically different from what it was before. Experience will also teach you when to lift, what sounds are bad, and most importantly, how to be as safe as possible while doing something that's, well, inherently dangerous. So go ahead, shake hands with danger. Then maybe you can impress the ladies. Or men, or droids, these days, who knows? And droids keeps with the Star Wars theme. And fun fact, George Lucas used to be big into drag racing too. But he did get into a pretty bad wreck that squashed his dream of being a professional drag racer. Which is probably for the best, not just for him, but, well, for all of humanity. May the Force be with you. Anyway, maybe you can impress the ladies by saying Danger is your middle name. Try it out and let me know in the comments how that worked for you. Now that you've watched this far into the video, here's a little secret related to all this stuff that we've been talking about, and it's one of the key reasons why the LTD picked up so much at the track on only 6 psi from the Sledgehammer electric supercharger. To be sure, the additional 205 rear-wheel horsepower had a lot to do with it, and that gain is way more than a conventional turbo or supercharger would realize on the same boost. But at these power levels, it takes about 15 horsepower to pick up 1 mile an hour at the track. Which means we should have only, and I say only because this is still a massive gain, but we should have only picked up about 14 miles per hour. And if you didn't know, mile per hour has a direct correlation to power at the wheels, much more so than elapsed time does. But we went from 114.5 miles an hour to over 135.5 miles an hour, a gain of 21 miles an hour when we should have only picked up 14. So where did the additional 7 miles an hour come from? Think back to what I said in method 1. You want to keep your engine in the RPM range that puts the most power to the wheels. Not torque, but actual power as in horsepower. We know that naturally aspirated, the engine makes peak power around 5,500 RPM. We also know that the torque converter will stall higher with more power and lower with less power. Two big things are going on. The converter designed for running under boost is effectively much tighter, meaning it will pull the engine down much further between shifts. In this case, without boost, the fallback on the shift is all the way down to 4,700 RPM, way below the power peak. And without boost, the car doesn't have enough power to pull itself up to even its power peak. It didn't even hit 5,400 RPM after the shift but before the stripe. That's because the shift point isn't high enough. We're putting down much less power to the wheels than we otherwise could have all through high gear, though the engine's power does tend to fall off a lot naturally aspirated by 6,250 RPM. This could also be fixed by more gear and a looser converter, or the more fun option, turning on the sledgehammer. With the electric supercharger running, the entire universe, well, shifts. The fallback after the shift jumps up to just under 5,450 RPM, though the power peak on the dyno is now at almost 5,700 RPM, and we're going through the traps at 6,300 RPM. If anything, we have just a hair too much gear. But as I said in the beginning of this video, sometimes close enough is close enough, and it's all a balancing act. And all that was close enough to put a 12-second streetcar into the 9s. Thanks for coming along on the shifty ride, and if this kind of stuff touches you in places you'd rather not tell your mom about, please consider subscribing, giving me a thumbs up, or even a super thanks next to the like button, or a buck or two to my Patreon. The link is in the description. Either way, I love that you're here, and I'm looking forward to your comments. And now it's time for your Moment of Roger.